Welcome everyone to today's msexchange.org webinar, another in a series of regular informational webinars hosted by msexchange.org, designed to deliver helpful and timely information to you, the MS Exchange community. Today's event is sponsored by eNow. eNow is a Microsoft Silver independent software vendor focused on helping organizations implement the latest Microsoft technologies and building software tools that simplify the job of IT administrators. Their innovative systems management software provides robust monitoring and reporting features for all key components of your Microsoft infrastructure, including Exchange, Active Directory, SharePoint, and Lync. My name is Roger. I'll be the event moderator, and before introducing our presenter today, I have a few quick housekeeping items. The first is to let you know that we are recording today's event. All participant lines are muted, so if you need any assistance, please use the questions feature at the bottom of your control panel. Send me a comment and I'll try to give you help. Please also use the same questions panel to submit any questions or comments you have during the presentation, and we'll try to address as many of those as possible at the end. Our presenter for today is Michael van Hornenbeck. Michael is a Microsoft Certified Solutions Master and Exchange Server MVP from Belgium. He specializes in Exchange, Office 365, Active Directory, and a bit of Lync. He is a member of the UC Architects, and in addition to that, he frequently speaks at various international conferences and writes articles for several tech websites. You can follow Michael on Twitter at @mvanhornenbeck or through his blog at www.vanhybrid.com. Thank you for joining us today, Michael, and I will now turn it over to you.
Thanks for introducing me. Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you are. And welcome to this interesting webinar for today. And the reason why it is interesting is because probably most of you have heard about the outage Microsoft had yesterday in Office 365, and it perfectly ties in together with the things that I'm going to talk about today, because we're going to talk about, what's life like when you're in a hybrid deployment. So basically, what's life like going to be when you're using Office 365, and at some point, and you rather hope that doesn't happen all too much, you're going to have an outage, and the way you're going to deal with that outage is something that we're going to talk about today. And I'll dive deeper into what happened yesterday and show you, what you can do to alleviate the pain. Obviously, there's nothing that you can do to solve that issue because it's at Microsoft's end, but at least there are things that you can do to help you see through the issue rather faster than later, I'd say, and that's one very important thing to have. So what we will be talking about today is what is it for you as an admin to be an admin in a hybrid deployment? How does that change you from being a purely Exchange admin into a Exchange plus whatever technology administrator? And we'll do so by talking some of the issues and misconceptions that exist about hybrid deployments and the tools and utilities around hybrid deployments. And we'll be talking about some of the common management tasks, including the moving of mailboxes, some good things about it, some rather ugly things about moving mailboxes, things to keep in mind, because definitely in a hybrid deployment, or if you're just using a hybrid deployment to move to Office 365, it's something you'll be doing quite regularly. We'll be talking about ADFS, because even though it's not a mandatory component in a hybrid deployment, I have yet to see a large hybrid deployment not use ADFS. All of them, and even the smaller ones, tend to use ADFS. Maybe there is, in my circle of clients, one or two that are using password sync, which is a very good alternative, but most of them, use ADFS, and we'll be talking about what is that ADFS thingy, and how do I keep it alive, and what are the things that I need to look out for to make sure, that it's up and running, or at least that it's not causing any issues for my clients. Same goes for DIRsync. We'll briefly talk about, what if DIRsync doesn't work, and how can you protect yourself from DIRsync failing, or what should you do when DIRsync is failing. And we will touch on that too. Then briefly talk by the end of the webinar about what's next, Office 365, what is coming, and how does that relate to you as an admin again, and how can you deal with that. And then the last 10 to 15 minutes we'll have time for some Q&A and then you can ask any questions you have about a webinar or any hybrid question for that matter. So what is a hybrid deployment? The reason that I'm starting off high level is because to me that is the root of all evil, understanding what a hybrid deployment is. Because the way that we look at a hybrid deployment explains why some of the things that we want to do work or just don't work. And typically I tell people this phrase that I came up with, that a hybrid deployment is a setting where two distinct cross-premises exchange organizations are combined to act as a single organization by means of a series of customizations in both environments. Now, if you let that statement sink in a little, all that you need to know about a hybrid deployment is actually in there, and everything that you need to understand what causes some of the limitations that we will be talking about is the fact that it's still, regardless of the customizations that you do in either or both environments, these are two distinct exchange organizations. We are talking about a sort of cross-forest exchange organization working together, and even though that most of the features are fully transparent to your end users, so they shouldn't notice that you're running hybrid, or they should almost not notice that you're running hybrid, you as an admin will face challenges that will come up that will be due to the fact that you're talking about the cross-premises organization's nature of that hybrid deployment. And more specifically, everything related to cross-premises permissions is today a pain point. It's something that is causing things not to work, and it is expected. It's not something that you should be surprised of, but it's something that you need to keep in mind, especially when moving mailboxes. That is going to be very interesting. But I'm not going to spoil anything that I'm going to talk about later. First things first. Now, when we're talking about a hybrid architecture, I like to show everyone the following slide, which kind of depicts the hybrid architecture as it exists today. The architecture picture that I'm showing you here might frighten you at first because there is a lot of interaction going on, a lot of components in both the Microsoft end of things and your end of things that are working together. And you can see that by all the the lines that are being drawn between components, between type of users, and with what components they actually interact with. And you should understand that this is a moving picture. Although that it's been relatively stable for a while, we have had to add OAuth to the picture, which was recently pushed forward by Microsoft as a future replacement for the organizational relationship. Now, when we're talking about future replacements and changes, we're not talking about something that's going to happen in 6 months. For some features, yes it is, but for the hybrid architecture, we're talking about being able to sustain this architecture throughout various Exchange versions. Exchange 2010 was capable of running in a hybrid. Well, Exchange 2010 is continuing to run on premises at customers, and it will do so for quite a while to come. So whatever change you made to that architecture, it has to survive time. It has to be able to support the lifetime of the application on premises, which is typically anywhere between 5 to 10 years. So even though that OAuth is being heavily pushed as something for the future, I don't expect it to take over the organizational relationship, which is a very important part in a hybrid deployment today. And I don't expect it to take that over anytime soon. So what you see here is several distinct areas. You have the Office 365 tenant, obviously, where we're focusing on the Exchange Online part. We've got Azure AD, which is the cloud backbone for everything that's Active Directory related. So even though that you don't necessarily have to have an Azure AD subscription, you'll still be using Azure AD to power up your Exchange Online tenant because it's pulling its data from Azure AD. And when you're synchronizing your on-premises Active Directory with Azure AD, you're actually, using that DIRsync server to do that with Azure and not with Exchange Online, even though that most of the documentation just say, hey, you use DIRsync with Office 365. Well, you do in a certain way, but you're actually doing it with Azure AD. And especially when we're talking about federation, things can become complex, because when talking about federation in a hybrid deployment, there are two types of federation that we need to keep in mind. We have the Exchange Federation part, which is the organizational relationship or the intra-org connector when we are using OAuth. And then there is the Identity Federation part, which heavily relies on Active Directory, the use of ADFS, maybe password sync, and Azure AD. Both are, federation type of things, but one is the Exchange Federation part, and the other one is the Identity Federation. And they shouldn't be confused. So when I'm using the term federation throughout the remainder of these of this slide deck, I'll try to remember and tell you, hey, this is Identity Federation, and now we're talking about Exchange Federation. But I might slip in just the word federation once in a while, and I just want to make sure that you understand where that comes from. So when we dive a little deeper into a hybrid building block, it's very important to understand the basics of that hybrid deployment. And there are like 4 pillars in the hybrid deployment. It's first the federation part, and I'm referring to the Exchange Federation part here, which allows us to do FreeBusy, mail tips, e-discovery, message tracking cross-premises between our on-premises and our cloud environment. It's being powered either via OAuth or through the organizational relationship, but most importantly, that's one of the cornerstones in our deployment for a functionality point of view. Then we have DIRsync, which is a mandatory component. You cannot have a hybrid deployment without DIRsync, and that's mainly because DIRsync is used for synchronizing objects across premises to make sure that the X500 addresses, which play a great role when moving mailboxes across premises, are stamped to the objects. So that's something that you cannot live without. Theoretically, yes, you could do that without doing DIRsync, but it's not supported if you do that. So I'll dive deeper into the DIRsync part when we're talking about troubleshooting DIRsync. And it's also an enabler for features like Exchange Online archiving, where you have your mailbox on premises, but still have an archive in the cloud, and these two coexist with one another, and DIRsync plays a major role there. We have secure transport, which typically means everything that goes back and forth between your on-premises environment and Office 365 is TLS encrypted, and we need that TLS encryption first of all to make it secure, but we also want to do header preservation because there are some X headers added to messages flowing between your hybrid deployment between Office 365 and on-premises that let the one or the other organization know, hey, this is a message from your partner organization, so you should treat it as being an internal message rather than this is a message from an organization that I don't know, so this is an external message. So that is very important. And then the fourth cornerstone or pillar is everything related to Mailbox Moves. Obviously, one of the biggest advantages in a hybrid deployment is the ability to be able to move mailboxes like if you would be moving mailboxes between 2 Exchange servers on premises. You can do that while someone is still using his mailbox. It is leveraging the same technology, so it is using the mailbox replication service, and they are in general reliable and relatively fast. Now, based on that fast part, there is one thing that you should know is that you're hitting a endpoint on the internet managed by Microsoft whenever you're moving a mailbox, and that's the same pipe where everyone goes through. So if you're using a large chunk of that, let's say bandwidth, or if you're using too much bandwidth compared to the other tenants, then Microsoft will automatically throttle you. So one of the effects there when moving mailboxes is that even though that it's relatively fast, you might sometimes experience certain times of slowness, especially when you're clogging up the bandwidth. And it's not so much that you're really clogging up the vast amounts of bandwidth they have in the data centers. It's just a precautionary measure just to prevent you from causing issues for other tenants in Office 365. So this being said, we have our basics right here in hand. Let's see how these basics relate to what your life is going to be in a hybrid deployment. And basically, what do you do as an Exchange admin in Office 365? Well, you'll still have your Exchange server on premises, maybe not as much as you used to have before, but there will still at least be a single Exchange server which you need to maintain. And that means that you need to keep that server up to date. If you're running Exchange 2013, that actually means a cumulative update almost every quarter. So you're not entirely safe from managing your on-premises environment. Even more so, if that server ever goes down or something's wrong with it, well, you better get that server up and running fast enough, because it is responsible for making sure that certain features like FreeBSD cross-premises or even Mailflow cross-premises, if you have some mailboxes on premises, still work. So it is a trivial task. It is something that you're used to, but you're still going to have to do that. Maybe not as much as before, but it's still something that you need to keep in mind. All too often, I have come across a customer that didn't really pay much of attention to that Exchange server. All of a sudden found out that they were running a really older version of Exchange, and I'm talking maybe Exchange 2010 Service Pack 2 without an update rollup, even though that Service Pack 3 and update rollup 5 or 6 is available, and they should have kept that up to date. So still mind that Exchange server if it's there, but what are other things that you'll be doing? Identity management, creating mailboxes, creating users, making sure they exist in both ends, and we'll talk about that. You'll be moving mailboxes back and forth, or maybe just onboarding into Office 365, either of them. You'll do patching on your servers, on your systems. If you're using ADFS, you'll be patching ADFS servers. You'll be patching the DIRsync servers, keeping them up to date. And if you're the admin that has to take care of everything, there is that client component that you're going to have to worry about, because there is a certain pace in the cloud, and I'll point out some of the issues there. You'll be doing monitoring, and hopefully, sincerely, and I mean that, I hope that you don't have to do the monitoring yourself by means of going out and running commandlets to make sure that things are working. It's not because you're offloading a piece of your architecture to Office 365, or even if you're running a piece of your architecture in Azure, it doesn't mean that you don't have to do any monitoring anymore. The monitoring is really crucial, and I'm going to point out to you why that is, and I'm even going to use the example of yesterday to show you the value of monitoring and why the changing landscape of monitoring is something that you need to follow. Now, last but not least, as I pointed out when I started this slide deck, you're going to have to do some troubleshooting, maybe sooner or later, but there is going to be a point that you're going to have to do it. So when we're talking about identity management, then typically in a hybrid deployment, all your user objects are managed on premises because they are synchronized through DIRsync. That isn't, something new. You create your users on premises, you wait for DIRsync to sync those users to Office 365, you mailbox enable them, or you maybe immediately remote mailbox enable them, all of which is fine, whatever approach you want to do there. But thing is that there is now that extra component that you need to take into account. There is DIRsync, which runs by default every 3 hours, and as long as you can live with that 3-hour interval, that's fine. But it wouldn't be the first time that the CEO or CIO is, breathing down your neck and telling you, hey, this needs to be in order right now. You have to do that today or within the next hour. Well, you need to take that into account, and you can either wait for DIRsync or you can force DIRsync, but at least it's additional work for you. If there is something that you quickly need to do, then you need to go into the DIRsync server and you need to run the start online coexistence command to force DIRsync to run before it's actually scheduled to run. And the thing is that these things change too. There was a way that you had to just run a PowerShell command from the DIRsync server, or actually run a PowerShell window from the DIRsync server and run that command. Well, they recently made a change, and the PowerShell script was now located in a different folder, and it's not big of a deal, but it's still, you need to keep up with that, and you need to take that into account, especially if you're working with delegation of control. Then there is the fact that sometimes people create a user and they need to enable the user for services in Office 365. They might not be able to access the DIRsync server, so how are they going to force a synchronization if they don't have access to it? That's, especially in larger environments, something that you need to be aware of. And then there is also, the accidental deletions part. I lived through the scenario last year where a customer on a sunny Friday afternoon came up to me and said, well, Michael, I think we have an oops scenario. One of our guys accidentally deleted the entire organizational unit for North America with about 15,000 objects in there. And to make things worse, the entire forest converged in about 15 minutes. So especially when you hope that Active Directory synchronization fails for once, it actually does what it's supposed to do, and it synchronizes all the changes throughout the forest in 15 minutes. But on top of that, they had DIRsync running. And you guess what? DIRsync ran exactly after 11 minutes after the deletion was done. So what happened is that all those deletions, they got synced up to Office 365, and all those mailboxes started disappearing, or actually they got soft deleted. So we were able to recover them afterwards, but hey, yeah, well, that's what happens. The user account on premises is being removed. Well, it automatically gets removed in Office 365, and because that oops scenario caused so much issues, I was very happy to see that there is a new feature in DIRsync which prevents from these accidental deletions. It's actually in one of the later versions, released at the end of May, where you now have the ability to configure a threshold which will take that threshold into account whenever you're synchronizing to Office 365 or to Azure AD. So if you accidentally delete an organizational unit with a few hundred objects in there and your threshold is set to 25, any synchronization attempt which has more than 25 deleted objects will be throttled. It's not really throttling, they just won't be synced. The DIRsync appliance will give you an error message and tell you, hey, there is something that you need to take a look here because I don't trust all these deletions. Are you sure you want to go through with these deletions? And you as an admin have to go in and actually confirm, yes, this wasn't an issue, this wasn't an accidental deletion, this is something that I wanted to do. And then, only then, at the next synchronization, DIRsync will replicate those changes to Office 365 and delete all those user objects. It's a nice addition, and it's also to point out how well the cloud adapts to scenarios that we live in. And we're not there yet. There are still those borderline cases where you'll end up in those oops scenarios that you don't want to end up in. But hey, it's a step in good direction. Now, monitoring hybrid deployments. I said it was important, and let's take yesterday's example. I followed the issue that Microsoft had with mail delivery being slow, being delayed, or not happening at all at certain points in time. And I monitor several channels like Twitter. It's a great source of information there. People were starting to complain like, hey, what's happening? We're not seeing anything. And I'm sure that a lot of people, I'm actually sure because I talked to some of them, they were troubleshooting, trying to figure out, hey, where is the issue? Is it us? Is it Microsoft? Especially because Microsoft did, for once, a very bad job at disclosing the issue. I think it wasn't until 3 or 4 hours after the first issue was noticed that there was actually an update in the dashboard or a public communication telling people, yes, there is an issue at our end. So this means that without any monitoring, you're driving your environment blind. You don't know what's going on. You have to go in yourself and try to figure out what's going on. You're basically troubleshooting. And even if you're a good troubleshooter, there's a lot of hoops that you have to go through to finally get to the point of the issue, to know where it is. And if you're very experienced, it might be something that you'll notice quite quickly. But not every environment has that, savvy Exchange admin on staff. Sometimes, mail delivery is so critical that the CIO comes down, blazingly shouting, yelling about, hey, what's wrong? You have to tell it to me now. And if then is the point that you have to turn to him and tell him, hey, well, I'm not sure yet. I'm pretty sure it's not really the answer that you want to be giving them. So the thing is that just like you monitor your traditional architecture on premises, you need to monitor your hybrid deployments. And you don't care about servers in the cloud. You really don't care, but you do care about service availability, about your end users being able to do what they need to do, that they are able to use the service that you actually bought from Microsoft. So how can you do that? Well, you can either run yourself a bunch of commands every half an hour and spend your days trying to figure out whether everything is okay or there are issues, or you could use a tool like Mailscape for Exchange Online, which goes out for you and does those active and passive tests against Office 365. We basically take the same approach as we had on premises, but we're doing synthetic transactions against Office 365 and immediately surface that to you. And I'll show you the dashboard later on today and to show you how quickly you can see, hey, there is an issue at Microsoft end, and then you can leverage that information to get into touch with Microsoft and tell them, hey, it's at your end, the clock's ticking because it's your SLA on the line. At least you have some leverage, and you can immediately pinpoint where the issue is. Just like you would when your Exchange servers were on premises and something wasn't working, you relied on your monitoring software to tell you what's wrong so that you can use that information to do something about it. So when we're looking into the monitoring space, what do you need to monitor? Well, that's where things change. Before, when you had your Exchange server on premises, then there was that Exchange server that you had to monitor, and maybe you did some sort of synthetic transactions on that server, which is great. But as I said before, it's much more than only Exchange today. We're talking about the Exchange server, the hybrid server. We're talking about identity federation if you have ADFS. We're talking about DIRsync. We're talking about certificates on the ADFS server on your Exchange servers. And we're talking about connectivity, being able to connect to Office 365. So anything in between your clients and the data centers of Microsoft is something that you need to monitor, or at least make sure that you're able to know, hey, is it an internal issue? Is it a connectivity issue on my end? Is it a connectivity issue on the internet? Or is it maybe caused by Microsoft? So these are all the questions that you need to ask yourself, and especially with regards to the connectivity part. One thing that we do in our tool is we do outside-in monitoring, where we will be testing the endpoints in Office 365 from a distinct location on the internet, and we will be testing your environment from the internet too. That way you can correlate the data and immediately see, hey, well, my monitoring software tells me ADFS is working internally, but it's telling me that externally my ADFS is failing, and I also see a report that people are not able to get onto their mailboxes when they are located outside of my network. Well, by correlating these three events, you immediately know, hey, there is something wrong with my inbound connection to my ADFS server, which could be that your ADFS server is having an issue on one of the network cards, the firewalls may be causing issues, your internet connection is giving you a hard time, but at least you can immediately know, hey, it's me causing the issue. If everything lights up green and people are still pointing out issues, then it has to be something at Microsoft's end. At least you have some leverage there. So that is very important and very a thing that you need to keep in mind, because typically, this space of monitoring hybrid deployments and cloud spaces is relatively new. But again, it isn't something that you should forget about, and definitely something to worry about. Now, when I talked about patching, I briefly touched upon the fact that you'll be looking out for patching your Exchange servers in DIRsync, and it's true, Exchange has their updates every 3 or 4 months. DIRsync comes out with an update every so weeks. There is a blog page or an RSS feed that you can follow, which will, post out whenever there's a new DIRsync version available. And you shouldn't maybe not always update to the latest version right away. You could, but maybe you're fine with running the DIRsync version that you're running now, but at some point you'll have to update to get new features like the accidental deletion features. So you need to keep track there. The same goes for ADFS and patching of those Windows systems. But more importantly is the fact that in a hybrid deployment, also your clients need to be patched, and you as an Exchange admin might not be responsible for patching clients, so you can hand that off to the teams responsible for it. But you as an admin for Exchange, for email, for messaging, you are responsible for making sure that the service is working for those end users. And I can assure you, if they do not keep up with some of the updates available for their Outlook client, they will end up having some issues. And in the past, it has been like that there was an update for Outlook available that you had to install to make something work because it didn't work before, or there was a bug. So that's something that you need to, keep up with. And, there are various blog pages and wikis and RSS feeds that can help you to stay up to date. And luckily there is, recently released, I think it was Tuesday this week, a roadmap blog which kind of tells you, hey, these features are coming. And by giving that information, Microsoft is actually telling you, hey, this is what we're planning on. So make sure that you think about these components too, or make sure that you are on that or that version from Exchange or DIRsync or ADFS in order to make these things work. So it gives you a little more time to prepare for these things. And there's that early adopters thing that you can opt in with, so that you get features beforehand, so that you can test out some stuff in your hybrid deployment. But still, it's something that you need to monitor more closely than you had to do before, because typically in an environment that I come into, Exchange admins aren't always in the latest updates. At least it gives you stuff to think about. So let's move on to moving mailboxes. It's also a very interesting part here, and I'd like to start off by explaining how Mailbox Moves work, just to avoid some of the misunderstandings. So when you create a mailbox, or when you move a mailbox from your on-premise environment to Office 365, what you actually do is you log in into your Exchange tools, you issue the remote move. But what actually happens is that the remote move is initiated from Office 365. So it is Exchange Online which will make an inbound connection to your hybrid server, the one that is dedicated or designated as a bridgehead between your on-premises server and on-premises environment and Exchange Online, and it will then pull in the data through the Mailbox Replication Service proxy to Office 365. And once that mailbox data is pulled into Office 365 and all the data is there, then the object on premises gets changed from a mailbox-enabled user to a mail-enabled user, so that all the redirection that happens on premises to Office 365 works perfectly. The key thing here is you're using the MRS, so the MRS proxy needs to be enabled on your Internet-facing web services virtual web directory. But it's more important to understand that it is an inbound connection through the Internet, through your firewall, onto your Exchange server. So there's no outbound pushing of data, it's actually pulling the data from your environment. So when we're looking at moving mailboxes, it's a trivial action. It's like running through a wizard and telling them, hey, these are the mailboxes that you have to move, and then you can typically sit back and relax and watch everything happen. As I said, one mailbox moved successfully, then chances are that 10, 20, 2,000 mailboxes will move successfully too. But before you move a mailbox, you need to make sure that certain attributes are available on the object, both on premises as in the cloud. The reason why I'm telling you this is a kind of a race condition, a borderline case that I sometimes get confronted with. But when you're setting up a hybrid deployment, the first thing that you want to do is actually move a mailbox and see if that works. Well, that's great. If you set up hybrid today and you're going to move the mailbox tomorrow, I'm pretty sure you won't have any issues. However, if you set up the hybrid deployment today and you want to immediately move a mailbox, chances are that you didn't have enough time for DIRsync to run, because it only runs every 3 hours. And when you run the hybrid configuration wizard, it makes some changes to the email address policies, and these changes need to be synchronized to Office 365 first. So when you try to move a mailbox, you might run into an issue that tells you, hey, I'm looking for an attribute in Office 365 and it isn't there. Well, make sure it's there. Maybe check one or two objects that you're trying to move. Make sure that they're identical at both ends, so that you know that you won't run into these issues, because the last thing that you want to do is kick off a large batch, a move batch, and then have to sort through the batch to see which objects failed, and then have to redo them manually, or have to restart that batch altogether. So that's just a little tip. And also, mind the permissions. All too often I get to a customer, it says like, hey, here I've got a batch of users that I want to move, and he says, this is my closed pilot. And then I point out to them, well, the delegates of that mailbox, the personal assistants, for instance, did you include them in the CEO's mailbox? And then typically it's like, no, we didn't. Well, if you want them to still have access to the mailbox, you have to include them to the pilot. And all too often I see that we start with 5 or 10 mailboxes, but by kind of correlating them together by means of the permissions, we get to a pilot that is actually more like 50 people, and there is a huge difference between 10, 15, or 50 people that you have to move during your pilot. So this requires some planning beforehand, and if you did that, all the better, but just don't forget about it, because the last thing that you want to do is move the CEO's mailbox only to hear the personal assistant complain about it later, because we all know that personal assistants typically have more power than the CEO, right? So some of the limitations that you need to keep in mind when dealing in a hybrid environment is that items larger as 25 megs won't be moved, because there is an item size limit in Office 365. So if you have a mailbox with lots of large items, well, you can either leave them be and then tell people, well, I'm so sorry, but we just embrace the cloud and you're going to lose all those items. Or you can use a script which is linked in the slide deck, and then actually actively go out to the mailboxes, find those items larger as 25 megs, and then export them and hand them over in a PSD file, or put them on the flash or whatever you want to do with it, so that you don't necessarily have to keep them on premises or lose them in a certain way. And then, as I said, permissions are currently not supported. There are scripts out there that can help you enumerate who has permissions to what mailboxes. There's one on my side as well, but make sure to include that in your pilot. So, how about high availability? Obviously, you don't care about how Microsoft deals with high availability at their end, but how about high availability at your end? Well, there are some components that should be highly available. If you will, please do the Exchange server, because that allows you to do maintenance during the day, or actually do maintenance without having a downtime in features for your users, which could be anything from mail flow to the organization relationship being free busy cross premises. It kind of makes sense. Same goes for ADFS. Make sure that it's highly available, and connectivity. If you cannot connect to Office 365, then what good is it to have access to Office 365 if you're not able to get there, right? You'll notice that I didn't mention DIRsync. Well, it's simply because DIRsync isn't really required to be highly available. I'll briefly touch upon that, and I'll also explain why that is in just a minute. So, when we're talking about the hybrid server and high availability, well, it's pretty easy. It's basic Exchange high availability. Deploy 2 servers. If you can, deploy them in 2 different sites. Load balance, traffic across both Exchange servers, and you should be fine. You can even have 4 servers, have them over 3 regions. It all doesn't matter. At least I'm happy if you have more than one, and even more happy if you have 2 of them or over 2 separate physical sites, right? It's a 1+1 scenario, and unless you're running hybrid to keep a certain amount of mailboxes on premises, this is basically all that you need, just 2 servers to make sure that your cross-premises nature of things continues to work. Pretty straightforward and pretty simple. DIRsync, as I said, that's not urgent. You can survive a few hours without DIRsync, only if you take into account that while DIRsync is down, any new user that you make won't be synchronized. Any change that you make to existing users won't be synchronized in Office 365. So there will be a delay before these changes will be visible in Office 365. Or actually, it'll take until you repair the DIRsync server or install a new DIRsync server. And that is actually a very good approach. I've seen companies deploy what's called a standby DIRsync server, which is just sitting there and waiting, doing nothing until the other one fails. The admin can go in and just start the services and it can take over, which means that you'll have a downtime of a few minutes. It's still a manual action to do, but you'll have a downtime of a few minutes. If you don't have a server to spare, well, don't worry about it. You can just spin up a new server, install DIRsync, and let it do whatever it needs to do. In larger environments, I can see where that is maybe going to cause an issue, because if you bring up an entirely new virtual machine with DIRsync, then it can take a few hours before it did its initial sync. So if you want to avoid that, you can use a SQL backend for DIRsync instead of the built-in SQL Express server. And then save everything there. You can then back up and restore it easily, and then bring up a new DIRsync server, connect it to the existing database, and you're up and running in no time. So there's no reason to keep it highly available or load balanced or There's no such thing required for DIRsync. So don't worry about that. Don't overcomplicate things when it's not needed at all. When we're talking about ADFS, however, we're talking about a more critical part. No ADFS means no user logon possible, which means that your users are not able to get to their services, regardless of where they are. So it is very important that if you choose ADFS, that you know what you're doing, that you know what you're dealing with, and that you make sure that it's highly available. And how you can do that is pretty easy. So typically, you have an ADFS proxy, an ADFS server which interacts through your domain controller. Well, you just add another one of them, another ADFS proxy, another ADFS server, ideally in 2 distinct sites, and you load balance traffic across them. Use a load balancer, use DNS round robin. I don't really care which one you use. Either works fine. Either has their pros and cons. But most importantly, make sure that you have a dual internet connection, a dual inbound connection able to your ADFS server, because what good use is your internet connection or your deduplicated ADFS environment if you just have a single internet connection which fails every now and then? Because you can build as much redundancy in the system that you want. If that's your single point of failure, that's going to kick your ass sooner or later. So keep that in mind too. There are other scenarios too which you can explore by running hybrid ADFS, by putting it apart in Azure, but that would lead us way too far. So to end the webinar, let's talk about troubleshooting, because troubleshooting, as I said, sooner or later you're going to do that. And how is that going to look like? Because we're talking about relatively new things, paradigms. How do you deal with it? Well, I'm going to break it to you. ADFS troubleshooting is not easy. There's a bunch of tools that you can use to try and figure out where it actually went wrong. You can use tracing in ADFS. You can use Fiddler, which is, by the way, a really good tool to do that for ADFS. But it's not easy. It's not something that you do in 1, 2, 3, especially if you've never dealt with ADFS before. It's something to keep in mind. You need to enable debug logging in the event viewer because it's not turned on by default, and I'll show you just in a minute how you can do that to get at least a little bit more information from your ADFS server. And there are some simple tricks that you can do. For instance, pairing an ADFS proxy with a single ADFS server so that you can have a predictable chain of traffic so that you don't have to guess, well, which ADFS proxy sent what traffic to what ADFS server. These are the things that I like to do when I'm troubleshooting ADFS. But most importantly, always make sure that you have a clear repro, because if you're trying to chase a ghost, especially something that sometimes happens and sometimes doesn't happen, you're basically in for the long haul, and that's something you don't want to do. So to enable debug logging in ADFS, that's relatively simple, although it won't always show you what the issue is, and you still might have to dive in deeper. But if you're in the event logs, make sure that you enable the analytic and debug logs, and then under ADFS tracing, you'll see that it becomes available, and you can enable the debug log, which gives you more information about what just happened. And if you're reproing it, you can follow the events as they come into the Crimson channel. So that's a very good starting point to look at more detailed information about the ADFS going wrong. Same goes for Exchange Federation. There's a lot of things that can go wrong. There's the part in Office 365, there's the part on premises, there is the Federation gateway that you need to take into account. Could be due to connectivity, but the one thing that you should be doing first is try to do a test organizational relationship and get more information. This is Troubleshooting 101. Just pointing out the obvious there. By using the test organizational relationship commandlet, you test the organizational relationship, you test the federation gateway, and you can see where the FreeBSD requests fail. Maybe it's a connectivity issue, or it'll tell you, hey, there's something wrong with federation trust. And then you can, continue to troubleshoot. Use the test federation trust commandlet to see what happened to the federation trust. Use the get federation information for a specific domain name to see whether or not you can actually query the domain information. If you're using OAuth, you can then use the test OAuth connectivity commandlet to check whether or not OAuth is either configured correctly or still working correctly, and then use that information to dive deeper and deeper into the issue until you get to the point where it broke, so that you know what you can do. So don't try and to overcomplicate things. Just do it one thing at a time, do a test organizational relationship, and continue further from there. Regarding the mailbox moves, there is no single tip that I can give you, hey, do this and you'll solve all your issues. But I can tell you this. There are error messages, and those error messages, especially to mailbox moves, are critical. Some of you might be saying, well, yeah, duh, and that's correct, but I've seen so many times an admin just go over, oh, it failed, and then click away the error message and start looking into all different spaces, trying to figure out why the mailbox move didn't work. Well, read the error message. 9 times out of 10, I noticed that the error message exactly tells me where the issue is. It will, for instance, tell you, hey, missing attributes on objects XYZ, and then you immediately know, hey, there is an attribute missing. What could cause an attribute missing? Oh, maybe DIRsync didn't run. Maybe the attribute isn't there. And at least you know in what direction you should be looking at. There are commandlets to make your life easier, like the test migration server availability commandlet in Office 365, which will actively go out to your endpoint, to your mailbox replication service proxy endpoint on your internet-facing client access server, and then give you back a bunch of information that you can use to diagnose whatever is going on with your endpoint, if it is your migration server, your hybrid server at all. And then about DIRsync, well, that's actually good news. It has to be good news at some point. Well, DIRsync, no news is good news. If you don't hear about it, it means that it's probably running good. If it isn't, you'll get an email telling you exactly what's wrong. And if you want to dive deeper into that, on the DIRsync server, there is the MIIS client.exe, which is the forefront identity manager synchronization engine management tool, which will give you all the information that you need. Now, beware, if you go in there, there's a lot of things that you can, whistles and bells that you can click and try out, but the operations pane, where you see all the run history, that will actually show you the issue there is. It will tell you the warning, point which objects are causing the issue, and then you can use that information from there to continue troubleshooting. Typically, things I encounter are permissions. For instance, if DIRsync is trying to write back to an object on premises but isn't able to make any changes, then it might be worth checking the permissions on the objects. But obviously there's so many things that come into play there that I could be talking about hours and hours about what could go wrong with DIRsync. But if it can be a little comforting, I don't see that many issues with DIRsync at all. So that's a good thing, isn't it? So just to end this slide deck today, I just want to briefly talk about who we are, software, and what we do is, we started about 10 years ago as Exchange admins. Our software grew from our experiences in the field, where we first used our software to do discovery in clients' environments and use it as a tool to help us do our job. And then from there, customers got interested in the solutions that we were using, and they wanted to use that software themselves. And that's how we rolled from being Exchange administrators and consultants into being still consultants, but also make that great piece of software where our dashboard is renowned for its simplicity and surfacing the information that you're actually looking for. So what I'm going to do now is quickly show you the dashboard and show you how easy it is to discover information. So when we look at the Office 365 monitoring part, you can immediately see that we have 5 areas where we have tests around networking, this directory, mail clients, mobile, and configuration. So obviously under the directory part, you'll see that we're doing tests for DIRsync, for ADFS, and we're testing the ADFS endpoints by doing synthetic transactions. We're testing DIRsync by changing attributes, syncing them, and or waiting for the thing to happen and checking whether or not the changes were there. So we're leveraging both these active endpoint, the active tests and the passive tests to give you a comprehensive view of your environment. So the good thing there is it gives you a one-stop overview of what's happening. Green means, hey, it's okay. Red means there's an issue that you need to investigate. And yellow means a warning, typically due to configurable thresholds. And whatever the issue is, we'll surface it and help you, dive into the issue without you having to run all those commandlets, because we already did it for you. Very much like we do that for on-premises Exchange servers to link and even BlackBerry servers, Active Directory. We monitor all that and use that information to surface it to you so that you don't have to care. And just for relating that to the issue we had yesterday, when mail flow wasn't happening yesterday, our clients were really happy running the software because they had the external mail flow, as you can see here, which is in a critical state because the mail flow wasn't working. So immediately when the issue popped up, they got a warning telling them, hey, well, I still received the message, but there was a really big delay. And then soon it turned into an error telling you, hey, well, I did the message test and I didn't see the message come in. And by using that information, they immediately knew, hey, there's something wrong at Office 365, and they were able to get in touch with Microsoft. So this is how you can, this is why monitoring is important, especially in a hybrid deployment. And the last thing I'm going to say is, if you're interested, please do a test. You can download, a free trial for Mailscape for a Change Online. We're currently the only company that does hybrid monitoring, so we can really give you the value that you're looking for, especially in hybrid deployments. So if you have any questions, now is a very good time to ask them.
Well, thank you, Michael. We do have some questions, so we're going to dive right into those. From Dan, the question is, on multiple ADFS, I thought Microsoft only supports a single ADFS IP address. If I have one ADFS server in a California site and a second in Nevada for redundancy, can I tell Microsoft to access either or both or fail over from one to the other?
Yes, well, you're totally right that you can only have a single endpoint, and I'm going to take back the slide which talks about ADFS high availability, and as you can see here, the endpoint is actually hidden behind the load balancer. So if you want to do multiple ADFS servers over multiple sites, you need to have some distribution mechanism to handle that. And either you go down the easy way and the cheap way of using DNS round robin, meaning that you'll add different external IP addresses behind a single external name. So for instance, adfs.mycompany.com has 2 external IP addresses, and then Microsoft will use both of them in a sort of round robin way. Or your client will actually use that depending on which type of authentication flow you have. Or you go down the load balancer route where you hit the same load balancer and it will distribute traffic. Or you use a cloud load balancer, a global traffic manager, GeoDNS, whatever fits your needs and your budget, of course, at that point. But you could easily do that.
Great. Next question is, what's the difference between DIRsync and ADFS? When should you use one over the other?
Well, I think you're referring to DIRsync with password sync or ADFS. Well, the difference is that when you're doing DIRsync with password sync, you're synchronizing a hash of the on-premises password to Office 365, but it's still Office 365 authenticating you in the end. So you're just, making sure that the password that you're configuring or that is configured in Office 365 is equal to the one that you're using on premises, even though there are 2 sets of credentials. They might just look alike, but they are still distinct credentials. If you're using ADFS, you're actually offloading authentication from Office 365 to your on-premises environment, which means that whatever authentication request hits Office 365, it'll get redirected to your ADFS server, which will then verify your credentials in Active Directory. So there is a difference on who is authenticating you, but in the end, for the end user, the experience will almost be the same thing because they will be using the same username, they will be using the same password. But in password sync, you're not just offloading the traffic, you're just synchronizing and letting Office 365 use that password to authenticate the user.
Thank you. The next question is from Brian. Brian would like the URL for the trial download again. Can we display that for everyone's benefit?
I'm going to check that for just a minute. I'm not sure if the URL was on the page, but it's definitely in, there it is. It's bit.ly/mailscape-hybrid. We will be, making the slide decks available when we reach out to you afterwards, so you can always revisit them here too. And if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be more than happy to help you with whatever questions you have.
Great, and I will mention that we've had a couple of questions during the presentation about whether the deck would be a copy of the deck would be available, and eNow will be making the presentation available to all participants via email within 24 hours, so you will be getting that. Next question is how do integration ADFS with proxy cloud? Not sure if I'm reading this correctly, or well, let's move on to well, let me just read it and see if you can understand it, Michael. How does integration with ADFS with proxy cloud NetScaler? Not sure what the question.
Not sure about the question either.
Yeah, for the questioner, maybe if you could repose the question, we'll try that again. We'll move on to the next one. If I have, here's another question on multiple locations. If I have multiple Exchange services in different geographic locations, can I set them all up as hybrid servers?
Yes and no. So there will be a single endpoint that you'll be using mainly for busy information, because that's the only endpoint that you'll have in the organizational relationship. Of course, you could create multiple organizational relationships, but these would then require different namespaces to be used. But you can have multiple Exchange servers over multiple parts in the world and use each of them for mailbox moves. So if you're, for instance, moving a mailbox from Asia Pacific to Office 365, then you can, specify the mailbox or the internet-facing client access servers in the Asia Pacific region as the endpoint where Office 365 should connect to pull in the data from, so that you avoid that they go through your European servers and then fetch information through the European servers in Asia Pacific. So yes, that is possible. It would require you to create multiple migration endpoints, but that's typically something you do with a single command, so that shouldn't be much of an issue.
Okay, we're continuing to get a lot of questions. I don't think we're going to be able to get to all of them because we're going to need to wrap up, but maybe we can get one or two more in. The next one is the Mailbox Moves slide mentioned X500 addresses. Do I need to do anything with these before moving mailboxes to the cloud?
No, so you don't necessarily have to do something yourself. DIRsync will actually, make sure that all the attributes are there where they belong, and by adding or by using the hybrid configuration wizard, you're stamping all the objects with the necessary proxy addresses so that Mailflow continues to work when a mailbox is moved from on-premises to the cloud or even back. So as long as all the attributes are actually stemmed by the components or are able to be stemmed by the components, you should be fine, and you shouldn't be doing something additionally yourself. However, I've seen environments where a lot of objects didn't have the check mark next to the option which tells them to automatically update the recipient addresses based on the recipient policy. A lot of companies uncheck them for whatever reasons. Well, if that's the case, then your hybrid configuration wizard will actually still stamp the email address policy, but the proxy address will not get stamped to that user object because it's not inheriting them from the email address policy. So that would be an example where if you do a mailbox move, it would actually fail because it tells you, hey, I'm expecting a proxy address, but I'm not seeing it there. So either you go into the that mailbox and then check the checkbox next to the option to automatically update the recipient, or you add it manually and then synchronize the user with DIRsync and then try the mailbox move again.
We'll go ahead and squeeze in one more question here. We are currently on Exchange 2010 SP3 UP6. We wish to use the free Exchange Hybrid Edition and remove our Exchange 2010 servers. Do you know of any reason not to use the free Exchange 2013 Hybrid Edition?
The short answer, no. I don't see any problems with that. The long answer, do you need to go to 2013? I'd say no. but there are benefits in doing so because Exchange 2013 just does a better job at hybrid than Exchange 2010. For instance, you would be able to leverage the new features like OAuth. Not that it's going to give you a lot of more functionality right now, but over time it certainly will. And then you might be able to benefit from whatever new feature is coming out that requires Exchange 2010 Service Pack, Exchange 2013 Service Pack 1 and later. So if it is an option for you and you're able to do that, then I would strongly encourage you to actually do that. But if it's just a question, should I, do I have to, then I'd have to say, well, there's no must-go reason for you to do that. But yes, it's definitely a good thing to do, and I wouldn't be opposed to it at all.
Well, on behalf of msexchange.org, I want to thank you, Michael, for, as usual, all of your insights and a huge amount of information that you shared with us today. We also want to thank eNow for helping to make it possible for us to bring you today's event. As I mentioned, you will be receiving an email from eNow within 24 hours with the copy of the slide deck, and also the recording of today's presentation will be made available both by eNow and at the msexchange.org site. So this concludes today's webinar. I want to thank you again for attending, and you may now disconnect.